Hey Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it is time for my review of the debut album from Deorro. This one is called Good Evening. Strangely enough, though not from Melbourne, Deorro is best known for his distinct brand of Melbourne bounce, a subgenre of electro house characterized by its offbeat bass lines and funky beats. Deorro played his cards just right and managed to get songs signed to Revealed Recordings and Dimmock in 2013. Then from there in 2014, Deorro pushed his way onto Spinnin' Records and Avicii's label Levels, where he released two of his biggest singles to date, 5 Hours and Flashlight. To this day, 5 Hours still remains as one of the most popular electro house songs of this decade. Sadly though, that song, as well as Deorro's career as a whole, kind of got milked for all that it's worth. 5 Hours had already had a fantastic vocal mix to it featuring Dicey, but then when Ultra Records picked up Deorro, they had to go and put frickin' Chris Brown on it and just, in my opinion, made the song to be a lot less enjoyable. Kind of taking this unique and fun electro house track and then just warping it into another dance pop Chris Brown song. Now, I've ranted about Ultra music many a time throughout my channel's history, but I think probably Deorro is the best example when it comes to Ultra just completely ruining an artist for me. And rightfully so, because Ultra literally took things from Deorro's music that made his music stand out from other electro house producers and then just flushed them down the toilet. Ultra bought the rights to a number of Deorro's free releases and then re-released them monetized. The worst of these being the song Booty in Your Face, which originally had this really distinct electric guitar fueled drop that just went really hard and was one of my favorite parts about the track and made for the song to be one of my favorite Deorro songs, arguably my favorite one that he had released at the time. But then when Ultra Records re-released the song, they literally released it as Booty in Your Face, no rock drop, and it didn't have that drop. And kind of what I'm trying to get at is that when Deorro announced that he was releasing his debut album through Ultra Records, I was incredibly worried that this album was just going to be another dance pop record like Benny Benassi's Danceaholic, of course, that released through Ultra last year, the one that was my least favorite album of 2016. Looking and listening through this album though, Good Evening really caught me off guard as being one of the best dance albums of 2017. Now don't get me wrong, this album does have its flaws, but I feel like Good Evening is at the least very groundbreaking in Deorro's career. With an electronic music artist like Deorro, you kind of expect their debut album to be set up banger after banger after banger, kind of like his No More Promises EP was. And because of that, a lot of those types of EDM albums tend to bore me a little bit. And this album, minus about 10 tracks or so, very well could have done that, but the thing is, it doesn't. The first thing I noticed when I looked at the track list of this album is probably the same thing a lot of people notice when looking at the track list of this thing, is that just about every other track is an interlude. And before actually listening through this album, that format kind of stressed me out a lot, and I thought this album was going to get really tiring really fast. And, well, not only do the interludes make for some of my favorite moments on this album, but allow the tracks to transition basically seamlessly into each other. And given the nature of these interludes, with a lot of these tracks being very airy, string-filled, and atmospheric, you'd kind of expect these transitions track by track to be very hard and sharp, but that just doesn't happen. Everything on this album is very smooth. This album feels very continuous. And we can kind of see this idea being pushed across just within the first few tracks on this album. With the intro, Good to See You, kind of giving off the vibes of maybe a live orchestral performance. Leading into the second song, Guide Me, which in the same way starts off very slow and string-filled and then kind of progresses. You hear the synth plucks coming in, you hear the vocals come in, and everything kind of speeds up, and then eventually you see Deorro experimenting with future bass, which I kind of never expected to hear coming from him. And that little speed up bit might be a bit reminiscent of 5 Hours, but this track still managed to surprise me in a number of spots. It's actually one of the few non-interlude tracks that really surprised me on this album, next to Honest Man and Let It Go, because I'd say comfortably that most of these non-interlude tracks that are on the album are kind of what we've come to expect from Deorro, carrying that panda funk sound that's made him famous. Though I definitely wouldn't say that Deorro doesn't experiment within this, because he totally does, especially on one of my favorite songs, Butt Naked, which kind of takes that sound and speeds it up, combines it with hardstyle and dubstep, and just made for something really wacky but enjoyable regardless. Or Me, Myself, and I and Rise and Shine, which kind of starts off with this little bit that Deorro seems to be directing, this jazz band of sorts, and then it kind of progresses into, you know, his signature sound from there. But it transitions very smoothly. Absolutely. Another thing though about tracks like these two is that in a lot of these places you don't really need to see these tracks separated into interlude and track. I think Ultra or Deorro, not sure who decided on it, might have gone a little bit overboard when it comes to separating these tracks, because the tracklets ends up becoming pretty messy and hard to navigate in the end. Even with an album this great and of this stature, there is absolutely no excuse as to why a 24-track album should only be 50 minutes long. In the context of this album, a lot of these interludes make a lot of sense, but in other places, a lot of them do not. Sounding a lot more like extended intros or outros of a specific song rather than a transitional piece between themes and different songs throughout this thing. A great example of what is, in my opinion, one of the best transitional pieces on this album is the interlude Sometimes, which transitions from a very difficult, much more up-tempo and bright Rise and Shine to the next song, Let It Go, which is much more cold and down-tempo. And how does Deorro transition from these two very polar pieces? With kind of this auditory image of the destruction of a tornado. As you hear these people mourning and crying, and as you start to hear the sounds of ambulances approaching from the distance, Deorro comes in, or at least who I assume to be Deorro singing, comes in and kind of serenades, transitioning into the next track. And even though some of these track cuts can be quite a bit awkward when you're trying to navigate through this album, if you're listening through this thing in a no-stop kind of deal, if you're just listening to this full album as a full body of work, you shouldn't really have a problem with it. And oddly enough, I think this album's biggest downfall is that it's very hard to return to these tracks individually because you don't really understand them in the context of the rest of the record. In fact, I can hardly see myself coming back to a single track on this thing without listening to the rest of the album surrounding it. And I'd say that, you know, without all the help of these interlude tracks on this album, a lot of these EDM bangers on this thing are pretty mediocre to me. And for me, personally, that's not going to be a terrible thing, because usually when I listen to albums, I don't go back to the single tracks, I go back and listen to the whole thing, so I can see myself enjoying this a lot in the future. But at the same time, I can kind of see why a lot of listeners aren't going to particularly like this thing, especially maybe his longtime listeners. Personally, though, I think this was a pretty fantastic debut for Deorro, kind of showcasing his production talents across the board, and maybe even a few hidden talents that we never knew were there to begin with. This is definitely one of the best albums that I've heard come out of Ultra's catalog in a long time, and I would strongly recommend it. For Deorro's Good Evening, I am feeling a decent 8 out of 10. As always, I have the Spotify link down in the description if you guys want to go check it out for yourselves, and if you have listened to this, I would highly suggest you let me know what you think about it down in the comments section below, because I think a lot of people have a lot of really interesting and different perspectives about this thing, and I'd love to hear what you think. As always, I'm Landon Remixes. I hope you guys enjoyed this review, and I'll catch you later. Peace.